Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. So today I'll be doing a gouache painting of a swan in a water lily pond. I also will be answering some questions as I paint, so feel free to put this video as your background while you're doing chores, or you can get out some paper and pencils to sketch and make some art with me. The first question is from Abaddon8342. How many layers can you do with gouache, like maximum layers? In my experience, this kind of depends on your paint, your paper quality, as well as how thick is each of your layers. If the mixture of each of my layer is very watery, then the number of layers I can add kind of depend on how much water can the paper hold. Generally, the higher graded the paper, the more layers it can hold. For example, a 300 GSM watercolor paper can hold more water compared to the 200 GSM watercolor paper, and therefore it can hold a lot more layers. Similarly, cotton paper also is better at holding water compared to cellulose paper. If I use very thick mixture for each of my layer, then I find that about 4 to 6 layers is where the paint is already too thick to be able to comfortably adding on another layer on top of it. Personally, I tend to have a bit of both in my paintings. I like to use very watery layers at the very beginning and then make them thicker as I move on to the next couple layers. And I think the maximum I've ever done is probably around 10 layers. Not to say this is the maximum gouache can do, but just in my experience, this is the most I've done, and I don't think I ever need to do anything more than that. And of those 10 layers, a lot of those were also fixing old mistakes. So if I didn't make any mistake, it's probably only need 6 to 7 layers at most. Next, RC Rosie asks, how do you match the colors and can you paint Ghibli scenes please? So when I match color, I tend to make the hue first, as if it is a green color, I would mix some yellow and blue to kind of make a green mixture. And then I determine whether it is leaning more toward a warm temperature or a cold temperature. If it's a cold temperature, I would add more of the cold color. In this case, it will be blue. Whereas if it's a warm temperature, I may add more yellow to bring that green to a little bit more of an olive green or something warmer. And then after that, I adjust the values of the colors by adding either white or black to the mixture. And if I want to desaturate the mixture even further, then I like to add the complementary color of the one I'm mixing. So if I were to make a green mixture and I want to desaturate that green, I like to add a little bit of red and just kind of adjust each of those steps until I get the colors that I like. In terms of Ghibli scenes, I have a couple previous videos on painting Ghibli scenery. I usually do Ghibli scenery as a study, but I don't enjoy painting them on their own as much because I feel like every time I finish a painting, it just never up to the quality of the original, because of course the original artists are like professional and they are awesome, and I just never be able to kind of create the exact same thing that they did. So personally, I enjoy just staring at Ghibli artwork a lot more than painting them. The next question is from Michelle Silvera 4595. Do you have any advice on how to create small details on trees? My first advice would be to focus on the bigger shape, the silhouette of the tree, and also the light and shadow values of that tree, because no matter how much details we're adding to the tree, if the silhouette doesn't read as a tree, or if the light and shadow doesn't match, then adding more details not gonna help our trees at all. Secondly, when I add details for trees, specifically the leaves, I like to keep my stroke relatively simple, so just use a very basic leaf stroke, but then I like to group them in groups of 2 or 3 or sometimes 5, and I place these groups over the trees instead of adding every single leaf one at a time. I also like to vary the orientation of each of the leaves groups as well as their sizes. I find that by doing so, it makes my trees look more natural and less symmetrical. Next, Penyo Shaved Head _ PTOB asks, how long have you been painting and how did you get into it? So I started painting in 2020 around when the pandemic started, and I have just like tons of time on my hand. Before that, I like to draw with pencils, and then I find that black and white only kind of boring, so I would like to try something new, and that's when I try watercolor first and slowly moving on to gouache and poster colors. Next, user-YT3MJ5IL1I asks, how do you choose the colors? Well, it comes from a lot of trial and errors just to see what color combination works. I also like to go outside into nature, and if I see something that catches my eye, I would take a picture of it and use it later as a color palette reference. Also, knowing some color theories in terms of harmonious colors or complementary colors can also help, because I can use them as a base and then try to pick out more transition or neutral colors in between the main color palette. The next question is from Okami Sealy 8614. What kind of paper are you using? Do normal acrylic canvases work with gouache too? Most of the time, if I'm just doing wet on dry, I like to use the Canson XL watercolor paper. This is cellulose paper, so it tends to get a little bit more buckle if I add too much water. So if I ever do, wet on wet method, I like to use something that is 100% cotton paper. My favorite brand is Fluid 100, but there are also a lot more other brands out there. The sketchbook I'm using in this video specifically is Hanamule 100% cotton watercolor paper sketchbook, which also I highly recommend. It's my favorite sketchbook so far. In terms of acrylic canvases, yes, you technically can use them with gouache. I don't enjoy them too much, especially the one that has been primed, just because gouache tend to like to be absorbed into the paper a little bit more. So I would need to use some medium or absorbent if I want the canvas to be more suitable for gouache. So the short answer is yes, you can, but you may find it a little bit tricky and you may need to do some extra work before you start your painting. Next, David C1878 asks, what do you think would happen if you let the paper soak in the water for a minute or two? Would it alter how it handles? This is from my extreme wet on wet video where I kind of submerged the paper into the water. I think at the point when I take the paper out, the water it probably already kind of soaked through the whole paper. So I don't think the amount of water my paper absorbed would change much if I leave it in longer. But if I do leave it in longer, I kind of had risk having the paper surface deteriorate if I have it in the water for too long. I don't think leaving it in for a minute would do it, but I would rather not risk it. Alright, so this is the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. If I didn't get to your question, I will answer them in the next Paint With Me video, so don't worry. And if you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment for me. It really helps with the algorithm. Other than that, I'll see you in the next video.